America! My name is Osei-Frimpong, and we're here at The Funky Academic. Today we're going to talk employment with Professor Richard Dien Winfield. And Professor Winfield is a professor at the University of Georgia. And we're going to talk employment because I think as a person, I should have the right, or I'm told I have the right, to work where I want to, because I want to, and employ whom I want to because I want to. And anyone who tells me that I can do anything different would be infringing on my rights as a good American. And I suspect that Professor Winfield's going to say that it's both that simple and then not quite that simple. And how we have to organize the way we think about employment and maybe rethink employment in order to make it square with rights. So, Professor Winfield.
Yeah, I think first of all we have to recognize that the economy as a distinct institution is not something given by nature. It's not a realm of necessity where we are subject to a kind of natural metabolism that we are fated to have to accommodate ourselves to as a certain kind of animal. It's rather a historically emergent institution, and it is an institution within which a certain kind of freedom is exercised. And a freedom is exercised by all its participants, which is to say it takes the form of rights. And what that means is that within the economy, and here I'm talking about the market as an independent domain, individuals participate in the market in a manner where they enter it on the condition of having something to offer that others choose to be in need of, and that they are there to offer it in order to obtain something that they have chosen to need. We're talking about a framework where individuals are interdependent upon one another because they're pursuing interests that take the form of having a need for commodities. And commodities are goods that are owned by individuals for the sake of obtaining commodities from others in turn. And that means that every time you interact in the market, you're on the one hand exercising a choice regarding what it is you want to obtain, and choice regarding how you're going to obtain it, but you're doing so only on the condition that in order to achieve these ends, you have to enable others to do the same. Right. So the nature of any such market institution is you're able to exercise what could be considered a right of need and a right of occupation. You choose how you're going to attempt to earn what you need, but you can only do so in a way which enables someone else to do the same. And in that regard, you're exercising a freedom whose realization depends upon allowing someone else to exercise that same type of freedom. So every market transaction has a certain kind of formal equality.
Right, so you're putting a constraint on my market transactions. I don't know if I appreciate that. I should be able to sell what I want to whom I want to because I want to, right? But you're saying no, it can't be that simple.
Well, you face all participants in the market face the situation that they can only obtain what they choose to seek after from others.
Right.
And they can only do so on the condition that they have something to offer in return.
Right, and they voluntarily offer it. I'm not coercing them to offer it.
Now, in doing so, all parties to the market are recognizing the property entitlements of one another, that they do legitimately own the goods in question.
I can't sell somebody else's stuff.
Yeah, I'm not going to unilaterally take what's theirs. By the same token...
I can't sell your house?
Yeah, and by the same token, you recognize that their need is on a par with yours. Their need has just as much a right to be satisfied as yours, but all of you are in a situation where you have to interact with others in order to do this, and you have to interact with them in a way that allows them to exercise the same kind of choices you're doing. But there is always the question, are you going to be able to find someone who has what you need, who is willing to take what you want in return? Now, of course, the introduction of money facilitates things. Right. You don't need to have precisely the object that meets their specific need. You simply have to have sufficient money to pay the price of their article. Right. And indeed, obviously, that makes things much easier.
Money makes incommensurable objects commensurable.
Yeah. So it might appear that this resolves the problem. Now we can all, in some respect, earn what we seek to have in a kind of reciprocity with others. But what money introduces is a kind of commodity, namely something that is the equivalent of the exchange value of all other goods and the standard by which they're measured. Money is that in which the prices of goods are determined and made commensurate. With money, you now have a different type of economic option at hand. Namely, you can advance money for the sake of obtaining more money in return.
Yes.
And now you have a kind of economic activity that's concerned with the accumulation of wealth. Very different from simply just trying to seek a good of your own that will satisfy a particular need.
So at the first stage, I used money to exchange with someone else for something that they have property, have an ownership over.
To satisfy utilities.
Now I could use money to make money for the sake of making money.
Now once you have a plurality of economic agents who engage in the pursuit of wealth.
For the sake of wealth.
For the wealth. This engenders a competitive situation where in order for them to remain viable, they have to, in some respect, offer whatever they're putting into the market, goods, services, in a way that's more attractive by price, by quality, etc., by marketing strategy. And to do that and be viable, they have to have more capital to invest. They have to expand. They continually have to grow in order to stay afloat. And what this involves is that it's no accident that the market becomes an economy in which more and more economic activity becomes absorbed into the activities of profit-seeking enterprises, but also the profit-seeking enterprises are not led by an individual who does their own work or who simply employs one person. Rather, because of the demands of competition that require growth and expansion and making use of all sorts of economies of scale, there ends up being more and more of a polarization among the participants in the market, where more and more people are employees or provider of services for a far smaller number of enterprises. And this produces a tremendous imbalance in the kind of opportunities that employers on the one hand have and employers on the other. Because if you simply recognize this basic fact, which is inherent in the nature of competition, because there's so many more employees than employers, the employees have far fewer options to earn a living than the employers do, who have a much greater choice of prospective service providers or employees.
So just saying that my rights and my employer's rights are the same kinds of things, and that my employer has a right to try to get as much money out of me, get as much work out of me without paying me, as I have to get as much money out of them without working. That's just the same kind of thing. It's just an exchange of rights. So you're saying that no, there's actually a structural asymmetry between employers and employees.
I mean, every transaction remains mutual, has a formal equality, but the options of the participants are fundamentally different. They're fundamentally greater on the part of the employer vis-a-vis the options of the employee.
Now, so I'm at a structural disadvantage when I'm seeking a job.
But this then poses measures that can be taken to even the balance. Now, in saying all of this, I want to make clear one thing, that the interests of employees do not have any intrinsic superiority over the interests of anyone else. Now, Marx, as a young man, made the mistake of claiming that the working class has a universal interest. And he made this claim that its interest was universal because allegedly workers have no property at all, and thereby they have no stake in society. They are the complete antithesis of society. They have only their chains to lose. And in that regard, they represent, in a sense, the overcoming of the kind of domination and inequalities, and thereby their interest has something universal in character. But what Marx would later recognize is that wage earners are not devoid of property. They have a particular commodity in their possession, which is the basis of their mode of earning, their labor power. So they have something, as well as whatever goods they may have, and they have a stake in civil society. They do have a stake. They have a particular interest. Now, both leftists today and rightists make the mistake of treating a particular interest as if it were exclusive, as if it should have a hegemony. You see it among certain leftists who will say the people united can never be defeated. And when they talk about the people, they're not talking about the citizenry at large or all adult residents. They're talking about two particular economic groups, the working class on the one hand and the peasantry on the other, to whom they are substituting in a way for something universal.
Hey, now, employers are people too.
Yeah, well, and other people who are engaging in other kinds of activities. By the same token, fascists do something similar. They take a particular group defined by race or ethnicity and privilege it as having an exclusive hegemony over all other groups. Islamists do the same thing with regard to the religious identity of Islam and want its law to reign supreme and exclusive.
Right.
So
identifying a particular group with the universal is a problem for our politics.
So properly speaking, all of these are just particular groups with particular interests.
And not necessarily a shared fate.
Yeah, and what we have to recognize is that none of them are identifiable with the good of the whole.
Right.
None of them are identifiable with the realization of the rights and freedoms of everyone. Right. What is good for General Motors
might not be good for me.
Not be good for you, not for the country, not for other firms. What is good for the United Auto Workers may not be good for other workers, may not be good for the environment, may not be good for other things.
So as I do a lot of black politics, and what we have to understand, what might be good for black America might not be good for the GDP. Might in the short term. So so people who say that the economy is doing good even if black home ownership goes down, that might actually be a true statement. The economy writ large might be doing very well, whereas black home ownership and black communities and black people might actually be doing poorly.
Yeah. I mean, what this tells us is that when we're concerned with the kind of activity, the kind of freedom that is concerned with universal ends, mainly the good of the whole, we're talking about political freedom. And it's wrong to allow political groupings to be defined in terms of particular interests. So there should not be political parties that are organized around a particular class interest, a particular ethnicity, race, religion, etc. In principle, they need to be universal. But in society and in the economy, where one is exercising a freedom that is concerned with exercising one's right to satisfy one's needs by a mode of earning of one's choice.
In a way that accommodates everyone else's right.
So here it's a question of ensuring that everyone has an equal opportunity to do so. And if the market is such that when it's not in any way impinged upon, one particular group ends up having an imbalanced opportunity, something has to be done, not to privilege a particular group, but to ensure that equal economic opportunity is at hand, that we have economic rights being realized.
So we've identified a structural imbalance between employers and employees. And we're not trying to privilege employees as some sort of special universal group, but we're just trying to write what can be accounted for as a structural imbalance in the way they fulfill their options.
And note that this imbalance is not directly altered by the fact that the ownership of an enterprise can take multiple forms. An enterprise or an employer can be owned by an individual, can be owned by a family, it can be owned by a public authority, a state, a municipality, a government. It could be owned by the workers themselves, but that doesn't alter the fact that the employer figures as an economic agent vis-a-vis a much greater number of employees. The employer is a person in that sense, despite those who want to argue that Citizens United was mistaken, that firms are not persons. They are persons, but no person has a right to use its economic wealth to gain disproportionate political advantage.
We can say that no person has a right to use their economic wealth to gain disproportionate advantage. But we don't want to say that an employer is a person, or the employer as employer, the company. The firm is a person in the way that it seeks truth in the same way that people can seek truth. Because corporations have a fiduciary responsibility for shareholder profit, not the
again, here you're speaking about a particular type of ownership, namely shareholding capital.
Right.
Which I think one can make an argument that the nature of competition fosters shareholding capital as a predominant form. Why? Because by allowing the firm to obtain capital from shareholders anywhere in the world, it allows the firm to gain access to more capital than any other kind of arrangement. And that could have ramifications concerning
on their personhood.
Also how widely dispersed ownership is. Right, there are various options, but that doesn't alter this particular issue concerning the imbalance in the options of employees on the one hand and employers on the other end. And we have to think about what are the remedies, what can be done. Now I'd like to suggest two domains in which something can be done. One has to do with the way in which the enterprises themselves are governed. Because as they tend to be governed, whether they're public or private, the employees do not ordinarily have any voice whatsoever.
So we identified a structural imbalance, but it turns out that instead of this structural imbalance being redressed, it's habitually exploited.
Well, or that the actual management of the enterprise, be it public or private, the control of how the enterprise operates is something in which employees have virtually no role.
Right.
That's one side of it.
Right.
So I think one can redress the imbalance in opportunities of these two groups by giving employees a significant role.
And that's what this is about. This is about redressing the structural imbalance and inequality and opportunities between employers and employees.
Yeah, and one way of doing it, which as far as I know has never been implemented in the United States, it has been implemented to some degree in other countries, particularly in Europe, and that is to ensure that the governing board of, in this case, private corporations, have a certain number of representatives of non-managerial employees. Okay. And I would suggest if you want to ensure that the employees really can have a say, that it would have to be 50%.
Okay.
So that they actually have a legitimate veto.
Right.
And this would have great implications for the way in which a firm will make decisions concerning laying off people, outsourcing, what will be the differentiations in pay between CEOs. It wasn't that long ago when CEOs only made 20 times what the average worker did. Now they make more than 300 times what the average worker did.
And because they assign their compensation by the board, if we put workers on that board, it might right the
so it's possible. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible.
Because right now, who's that board made up of? Right, as it stands, who's the board made up of?
And usually they're cronies of the CEO.
Okay.
It's not someone who's going to restrain the CEO and give them anything but fantastic pay balances and ways of being laid off with tremendous benefits.
So
that's one side of it.
No, but let's do this. So that seems to work with something like GM. Now, what about, let's take it closer to home. What about university president vis-a-vis the trustees? Would you have...
Well, if you think of a lot of public institutions,
right.
Think about how generally public education is hired in many places. You have a board of regents.
Right.
The board of regents typically does not include educators, let alone staff people. It basically has business people, primarily, or political cronies of one sort or another.
And you think that distorts the way they consider working conditions of...
Well, it certainly means that no one who is or is a representative of employees has any real voice in the decisions that are determining the fate of the enterprise itself. Now, that's one side of it. And this would have to be mandated by law, right? A law that would require the governing bodies of these kind of employers that are presiding over multiple employees, that they would have to incorporate a fair share of employee representation.
To redress the structural imbalance between employers and...
Now, the other side of it is to deal with ensuring that the employers are able to join together to bargain collectively with the employee. Now, some conservatives like Friedrich Hayek have argued that this is a form of monopolization, where the workers are banding together to have a monopoly over labor and thereby to obstruct the freedoms of the marketplace. So someone like Hayek, although he generally speaking is for complete laissez-faire, he is willing to break up monopolies as a way of getting back to so-called true competition. But in the case of the right of employees to join together and form a social interest group of themselves, of their own.
Well, that's what it is, a social interest group.
A labor union or the equivalent. This really is to rebalance a lack of opportunity, not to, in a sense, privilege a particular interest in a way that gives it a power that is undue with regard to the opportunities of another. And if we think about this, in this country there's been a steady decline in union membership since when I was born, in last mid-century. There were like 35% of the workforce
were
unionized.
7.
Now, it's actually a little bit below 12 if you include public employees, but it's below 7. It's 6.6 in the private sector. And this has been accompanied with an almost equivalent decline in the share of income that goes to wages, that goes to employees, which should not be that much of a surprise. And the decline of union membership is reflected also in the decline of the job, in the sense that employers who, in a sense, are not being countered by either employees having any control in the running of businesses or having much opportunity to engage in collective bargaining, they're getting rid of full-time employment and substituting part-time contract employment, the gig economy, where people don't have to get any benefits, don't have to have any stability, and also can be paid less.
Right.
And so, to some degree, these things all are happening to some degree because, at the same time, employees are so disempowered on both fronts, both in terms of the way firms are managed and also the fact that they're stuck in isolation. And that isolation is particularly the case if you think about all the people who are part-timers or freelancers.
Right.
They're off by themselves, they're completely isolated, they have no way of making a common front. They're basically, it's all one big plantation, where you as an employee, you either take it or leave it.
Right.
And if you leave it, you're in big jeopardy, especially in a country like ours where most of the benefits that you need in order to exercise your freedoms have been supplied by a job. But when the job itself is becoming, so rare, now apparently the amount of people of working age, the percentage of people of working age who are actually fully employed is at its lowest ebb in history.
But we call this like the entrepreneurial economy.
Yeah.
And we're all just entrepreneurs. And instead of having one job that defines my identity, I have different streams of income.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't I have different streams of income? And
well, look, it's true that in a sense, it's a mistake which was made by many economic theorists to think that an individual can only exercise one particular type of earning at a time. You can, especially now with shareholding corporations, you could be drawing dividends at the same time that you're a wage earner. You might even own some property you're renting. But that doesn't necessarily alter the fact that your situation is such if you have to rely upon earning a living as an employer, as an employee. That signifies that your other options for earning are not sufficient to get you by. Whereas those who can earn because they own a business or because they own rentable property, they have enough of that to avoid having to seek employment from someone else.
So if we're going to employ people, we have to employ them well.
Well, I
seriously,
I think you have to recognize that, admittedly, this freelance economy has some people think it has advantages. You have a lot of, supposedly, you have a lot of flexibility, choice of when you go to work and so forth. But this happens at the expense of having any real power over the conditions of your working.
Right.
So what I would think we have to do, given how weak unions have become, given how hostile governments have become, with all sorts of legislation, even outlawing collective bargaining. For example, I'm a state employee here in Georgia, which is a so-called, right-to-work state. Well, what that right-to-work means is that all public employees are denied the right to engage in collective bargaining. I could understand that if I were in Nazi Germany or in Stalinist Soviet Union.
So when you said deny the right, that means you can't talk with other professors about how much you're not allowed to exchange?
We're not allowed to actually engage in collective bargaining with the university.
So
as a result, we are isolated.
What about as a social club?
Well, we're still not allowed to do that, apparently. and that has been, as you know, many states, Scott Walker has tried to do this. So what I think really needs to be done is to, by law, mandate that any employer who has multiple workers, either part-time or full-time or freelance, they have to be mandated by law to engage in collective bargaining with the elected representatives of their employees.
Oh, okay.
And that would be something all such enterprises would have to do. Right. Now, that would not mean that we're shutting out labor unions. If there's a labor union, you already have something with whom that can be done.
Right.
Also, they could choose to join the labor union as opposed to setting up an organization of their own.
Right.
And I think the logic of things is that at some point it makes sense for employees to band together with employees in the same line of industry of different employers and act in concert.
Right.
They can be more effective in that way. But in any event, we would at least have something in play that would really completely transform the situation of employees vis-a-vis their employer.
Excuse me. So this structural intervention isn't without precedent, right? There was a time before the National Labor Relations Board.
Yep.
There was a time before the National Labor Relations Board where people sat around and said, look, we need a government intervention to redress and make right the imbalance of power between employers and employees. So we need to form an entire board. that has power. There was a time before the National Relations Board, and this could be the time before, for example, the board or the mandates that you're requiring.
Yeah.
And so, like, people who think that this is a huge and unprecedented intervention into the labor market, no, it's not any more stunning than I imagine the National Labor Relations Board was taken in 32 or 33.
Yeah, I mean, it at least provided a framework where in principle, workers who were trying to unionize, could not be fired or laid off for their organizing efforts. They would have regulated elections and so forth. But it's proven not to be sufficient under current circumstances.
And so we just
especially when you have this gig economy, especially when you have part-timers, it can't be done in the same way.
Right.
So I think we as citizens have to step in and ensure that this is a condition of doing business in our country. Why? Precisely so as to allow everyone to exercise their economic freedom.
All right, so let's talk about, so this is universal, not unionization, universal.
You could call it collective bargaining if you want.
Universal collective bargaining.
Employees would have elected representatives who would be able to put their case to the employer.
And this would go all the way to the top, right? When we, with regard to transnational business agreements, right? Yeah. So these representatives would also.
Yeah. And this is one of the factors that makes it difficult for trade unions to succeed in the current environment, with corporations becoming more and more multinational. They can always attempt to ignore the demands of workers in a particular nation by transferring operations somewhere else.
Yeah.
So ultimately, this would be something that would have tremendous impact domestically. It would have to be coordinated, ultimately, with similar organizations elsewhere.
Yeah.
And in the current state of affairs, in many countries there are much stronger labor movements still around, although they too are under duress for some of the same reasons.
But a lot of these reasons are political. So if we actually had a political culture that encouraged and supported the growth of organized labor in, say, China or Mexico, then
and don't forget the impact of an organized employee movement or employee empowerment on the political climate itself.
Right. Oh, okay.
Because in the current situation, it's almost an imperative of competition that firms use their resources to gain as much political influence as possible if that promotes their competitive situation. So they're
vis-a-vis other corporations or their employers
or
anything. Employees.
But they are driven almost as a matter of survival. As long as we allow them to do this, to pour their money and resources into the political sphere and try to influence voters, try to influence, elected officials to promote their policies. This is itself rooted in the dynamic of competition. That also has to be curtailed in some way to protect, our equal political freedom from the domination of particular social interests.
Okay.
And obviously, altering the character of management will have a role to play on what kind of political interventions employers are going to be motivated to engage in.
Altering the character of management. Okay, so there's going to be pushback from management. But, on some level they might be resentful of their situation also, so who knows.
We will be redeeming them, in a sense. because look, it's not as if all managers or owners or leaders of employers are only completely self-interested and have contempt for their employees or for the environment or for the public interest of the law. But they're in a situation where if they go out of their way,
fiduciary responsibility.
But if they exercise that and they do so in a way that can be undercut by competitors, it's not going to be viable. So if we make it a condition for doing business that you have to give your employees due respect, then they can be ethical.
They can be ethical
and economically viable.
Well, good. So just make it a condition of doing business that obviously you're going to have to bargain with your employers, your employees.
And then you use, obviously, you can do that within a nation as a whole.
Right.
Then the question is, to what degree is this harming the competitiveness of domestic economic activity vis-a-vis what's outside? And that you can have an impact upon by your control over commerce in various ways.
So we have two institutional interventions. One, get a sizable a respectable amount of employees on the board and mandate this. These are political interventions.
Yes.
Mandate a sizable number of employees on the board of these larger corporations.
And when we say sizable, enough to make a difference, which I think 50%
you gotta
guarantees that. It's a veto power, in effect.
All right, enough to make a difference. And then two, mandate the ability, actually mandate membership into a social organization that would bargain with the employers. So elected representatives of the employees are tasked with bargaining with the employers.
So you'll have on a regular schedule elections.
Right.
If an employee doesn't want to participate, they don't participate, just like national elections.
Yeah.
But the employers will be required to negotiate in good faith with these elected representatives.
And what if they don't come to a resolution?
Well, then we have the situation where the parties in question have the right to take various kinds of actions that are such they don't interfere with the rights of others, which can involve, in the case of employees, they can have work slowdowns, they can have demonstrations, they can have strikes.
What about getting locked out?
The employers could try that if they want, but this is something where if these things become too disruptive, then you can say, okay, there's a rationale for there to be a mandatory arbitration.
Okay.
If this becomes disruptive of the interests of others, which it can be.
Very good.
So, there are various ways of handling this. Obviously, there's no guarantee that an agreement will be reached, or that the agreements reached will necessarily be for the good of all, right? There are still considerations that go beyond what can be achieved through these measures. They're part of the answer, and an important part of the answer, but they're not the whole answer to how we can really deal with all of our rights.
Good. So besides those two interventions, the board intervention and mandated negotiating with elected representative of laborers, are there any other interventions you want to give to the people?
Well, one thing we have to recognize is that we are on the cusp of tremendous technological changes, which are going to allow a new scale of automation, such as has not occurred in the past, and also ways in which technology facilitates all sorts of, shall we say, off-site employment in various ways. So the question is, how will this be implemented? You can implement automation and these various changes in work in ways that are detrimental to employees. Or you can do it in a way that will not be detrimental to it. So it's important that the
notion that we should just let the market handle it is naive, you would say?
Yeah, because what will be for the sake of essentially the maximization of profit is not something that necessarily maximizes economic opportunities of employees. And one thing that I think is clear that needs to be emphasized over and over again is that if you recognize that these measures are in all likelihood going to forestall the kind of increase in inequality of wealth, and in particular forestall the continuing decline in the share of national income that goes to employees, that will have ramifications that will enhance economic activity and dynamism. Because the greater the inequality of wealth, the less of the wealth is actually being put back into the economy in a productive manner. Because the more you have great divides in rich and poor, the rich are not able to spend all that much of their wealth, whereas those of more modest means are going to spend much more of it. Right. That goes into the economy.
The velocity
it increases consumer demand, it increases investment to produce the things that they are going to be using with this additional income. It all has this kind of multiplier effect that will enhance economic growth. And the decline in union membership, the decline in the portion of wealth going to wages, has also been associated with a decline in economic growth.
But productivity is up.
Well, that's the interesting thing. One speaks about the decline in manufacturing. Actually, our manufacturing has produced more wealth than ever before in American history. Yet it has declined in terms of employment to, I think, less than 12 million workers. Now service workers make up 86% of the workforce. And it's not necessary that this be the case, but the service industry is much less unionized than others. And employers have managed to make it a low-wage industry. And economic projections are that in the next couple of decades, more and more jobs are going to shift from being medium level wage to low wage.
Right.
So we're really facing a decline in income. There's already been a decline of income. There's been a stagnation and decline of income since the mid-'70s. But unless significant structural changes are made, it's going to become much worse as these advances take place. And that also signifies there's going to be much less economic growth as a whole. Because with this decline in the purchasing power of employees, there's simply going to be much less demand. So even if you trickle up all the money, right, to companies, and they're not going to invest it productively because there's not a market for buying their goods.
Good. All right. Well, thank you. So steps going forward would be, steps going forward for those who actually care about raising wages and righting the imbalance between employers and employees would include pressuring legislature or just removing your local legislator and pressuring our legislators to advocate for mandates for employers to bargain with their employees, or mandate worker participation at the board level. I want to say that we've already, there's a precedent for this with respect to gender imbalances in the workforce. I want to say it was Canada who mandated a certain, or is deliberating on mandating a certain number of board members must be women. Right? Is that, have you heard?
It could be. I know that's happened elsewhere in the world. I think in Northern Europe too.
So there is precedent for mandating the composition of boards in order to reflect fairness and righting imbalances in the operation of the firm.
But I think one also has to think about what is the root cause of such gender imbalances. And I think a large part of it has to do with the way in which there's been a failure to organize earning so that it does not conflict with one's household responsibilities. And the particular situation of women around childbirth and the like, and the way in which all of that has been treated in a manner that women, because of that, are unable to advance their careers on a par with men. So one has to think about how to reorganize working and the conditions of work to eliminate that problem. So not only you have significant parental leave, but you guarantee both men and women the opportunity to come back to their positions without losing seniority.
Right. So I have a right to earn money. I have a right to raise my family. And I have a right to participate in my government. Right?
So that also has implications for the workplace. So that, for example, if you're an employee, your employer should be obligated to hold your job for you if you choose to run for office, as well as there should be some means to supply you with income while you're running for office when you can no longer do your job. But you should also be able to come back to the workplace and without losing seniority and so forth. Otherwise, how can most people have a chance of exercising the right, to run for office?
So all of these spheres of right have to work in tandem. And if there's some sort of discord in the spheres of right, that means none of these rights are actually operating as rights. They're actually operating as privileges of one class, usually against another class.
And there's nothing set in stone about a 40-hour work week. I mean, Americans, partly because of the weakening of the labor movement, work longer and have fewer vacations than any other workforce in the developed world.
Right.
But there's no reason that, the 40-hour work week, which was what May Day was all about, more than 40 years ago,
right.
Why we have to stick with that? I mean, after all, there's no reason why it couldn't be reduced so as to give us the opportunity to engage in other activities, like dealing with our family responsibilities, dealing with political involvement.
Good. All right, so the next show we have, we're going to focus on the family, as other institutions have done before us, and talk about what it is to have a right to what are family rights and how they intersect with and somehow shape our economic rights, which then shape our political rights, and how our family rights shape our political rights, and how that works together. But we're going to start with the family and grow out. And today, this episode, we started with employment and grew out, how the sphere of employment and rectifying any imbalances between employer and employee affects one's ability to earn a living, and then also, take care of one family and participate in the politics of your life. And so the interventions, once again, I want to bring home that the interventions that you are suggesting, both in changing the composition of boards and mandating that employers who employ multiple employees must negotiate with elected representatives of those employees, they're not unprecedented in the history of modern capitalism. There was a time before the National Relations Board, and then there was consternation in forming the National Relations Board, and now there's the National Relations Board, which was effective for what it was at the time, but the shape of the economy has changed, so now we need a political solution that's adequate to the current shape of our political economy, right?
We have to remember that one of the limitations of the National Labor Relations Board is it does not apply to all employees.
Right.
This is something that would have to apply to all employees, no matter what, at least as long as they are multiple employees or service providers for a single employer, and whether they're part-time or full-time. Now, it still leaves out of account employees who work individually for a single individual, like domestic employees.
Right. I mean, this was the National Labor Relations Board came about as part of the New Deal, and in order to get Southern Democrats in line with the bill, a lot of the New Deal legislation left out farm workers and domestic employers because Southern Democrats at the time were the white supremacist function of the electorate. So, if we are to mandate these interventions, we'd have to do it with a specific eye towards making sure that historically marginalized communities were not compromised for the sake of other particular interests.
And I think one also has to recognize that these rights have nothing to do with the citizen status of individuals. They're human rights. Anyone who is in a certain territory has these rights to work, to get their needs satisfied. It doesn't matter whether they are here illegally, as long as they haven't yet been deported, they have rights that have to be addressed.
And so far as they're here, they're here. Good. Thank you for your time.
Okay, great.
And thank you. Hey, look, if you like this video and you want me to keep doing more videos, first, share this video on your Facebook page. And also, subscribe to the channel. It's on YouTube. It's playing right now. Thank you, YouTube people, if you're watching right now. Maybe next time we'll do a call-in if I see if people have interests in doing that. We'll have a call-in section of the video. And share this video, like this video. That way more people on your Facebook feed find this video. And also subscribe to the channel. And if you want to see kind of more interesting work, you can go to www.thefunkyacademic.com and take a look at previous videos which I've done. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your time, Professor Winfield. And the next time we talk, we're talking household and family rights and what that means for employment and political rights.
Great.
All right.